Hey, this is Wes from PC Gamer, and this is our performance analysis of Mass Effect Andromeda. After 5 years, a new Mass Effect is here, and a lot has changed since Mass Effect 3. BioWare has switched from the Unreal Engine 3 to the DICE Frostbite 3 engine that's used for Battlefield 1 and Dragon Age Inquisition. With Frostbite, Mass Effect is running on a modern graphics engine. It's a major jump in technology, although currently Mass Effect is missing the DirectX 12 support that Battlefield 1 has with Frostbite. Andromeda's environments range from dense rainforest to sterile rocky plains that stretch out into some gorgeous mountain vistas. It can look amazing aside from some pretty awkward character animations. The open world means Frostbite behaves much differently than it does in Battlefield. In our testing, frame rates in Andromeda are sometimes even half what we saw in Battlefield 1. Today, we're going to be showing some benchmarks of Andromeda from a sequence we ran on the planet Eos, one of the more demanding areas early in the game. Keep in mind that Andromeda is a huge game with open world combat and exploration, so performance can and will vary. Expect significantly higher frame rates on ships and space stations, for example. For parts of the game like Eos, entry-level cards like the GTX 1050 and RX 460 will only be able to handle 1080p medium, and even then you're not going to get a full 60 frames per second. Move up to the next level, the GTX 1060 and RX 470, and you'll be able to handle 1080p Ultra, but you'll still see drops below 60 FPS unless you tweak some settings. For 4K Ultra at 60 frames per second, you're gonna want at least a GTX 1080 and probably a 1080 Ti. Before we get to the benchmarking, let's talk about what you're gonna see. We have some real-time frame rate graphs at the bottom of the screen comparing 4 GPUs across 4 different performance categories: 1080p Medium, 1080p Ultra, 1440p Ultra, and 4K Ultra. The captured video won't correspond directly to the performance of the cards on the chart. It's just there to illustrate our benchmarking path on Eos along with the visual quality of each setting. Okay, let's jump into our testing of some entry-level graphics cards. These low-end cards may not be able to handle 1080p Ultra with great performance, but 1080p Medium is a viable alternative. Turning off the high-quality temporal AA and running FXAA is a painful visual trade-off, but temporal anti-aliasing does cause a big 10 to 15% performance hit. Even with temporal AA on, the entry-level cards run Andromeda pretty well. Not 60 FPS smooth, but certainly playable. Other than the 1050 Ti and below, everything here easily runs 1080p medium, which means you can bump up a few settings and still run well above 60 FPS. Shooting for 1080p and Ultra settings will require a surprisingly high-end card if you want a constant 60 frames per second. Here you can see the 1060, 1070, and 1080 from Nvidia with the RX 480 from AMD. The GTX 1080 can handle 1080p without any trouble, unsurprisingly, while the 480 and 1060 fail to run 60 FPS on Eos. But Andromeda is very playable above 40 FPS, so all of these cards pass. Testing entry-level cards shows us that cards with 2GB of VRAM really struggle to handle Andromeda at Ultra settings. You'll really want at least 3GB of VRAM with a card like the GTX 1060 to get close to 60 FPS Ultra at 1080p. If you have a high-end PC, you'll probably want to crank up the resolution right along with all the bells and whistles, and you'll need a high-end card like the GTX 1080 or 1080 Ti, which were the only ones to average more than 60 frames per second at this resolution. Keep in mind that if you have a G-Sync or FreeSync monitor, Andromeda will play smoothly even if it dips below 60 frames per second. And again, remember that this is one of the more taxing areas we found in the game, so often frame rates will be much higher. 4K gaming, as usual, remains an absolute beast. Even the mighty GTX 1080 only gets about 40 frames per second, and the 1080 Ti still can't quite get to a solid 60 FPS. Dropping to high settings adds another 10% in performance, so if you want 4K on a 1080 at 60 FPS, you're looking at medium to high settings. And of course, some overclocking could help you push that performance a little bit higher. Other cards will have to make much greater compromises on settings if they're going to have a chance at 4K in Mass Effect Andromeda. Looking at AMD versus Nvidia on the whole, AMD performs quite well. A driver update pushed performance of the RX 470 and 480 ahead of Nvidia's 1060, making AMD's mainstream GPUs a clearly better value. Thanks to MSI for providing the graphics cards and systems we use for our testing. Our test bench is MSI's new Aegis T3, which has a 4.8 GHz i7 7700K processor, 64 GB of RAM, and a terabyte of solid-state storage. MSI also provided 3 of their gaming notebooks for testing. Unfortunately, we ran into a problem with Mass Effect where our press accounts got locked out after running on too many hardware combinations, so we'll be testing those notebooks in the near future. Make sure to check out PCGamer.com for more in-depth testing of Mass Effect Andromeda, a whole lot more Andromeda coverage in general, and more performance analysis of big games in the near future.